We're ready to roll, I think, and we're doing reproduction 4, and I have titled this Ovarian Histology. And I've got a picture here. This is not a histological picture, but it's a photograph of a cat, ovary I believe it was, cat. It doesn't really matter if it's a cat or dog, they're very similar. But I just want to refresh your memory. You know, the ovary, we're going to have follicles and corpus luteum, and we're going to spell these things out later. And on this diagram, probably two widths of those ripe follicles equal like a pencil width, to give you some idea. And the dog would be very similar, and a dog has a little bit bigger ovaries because of the body size difference. Again, I want to show you now a couple dog ovaries, and I just want to remind you of size before we actually look at the histology. So if you see this slide here, this is in centimeters, and from the 0 to 2.5, that's 1 inch. And you can tell that those two dog ovaries aren't even an inch across because this is all fat here. And then the ovary tends to be in a kind of like a thin membrane called, what I call at least, the bursa. So you would have to dissect in here to get to the actual ovary. Okay, so just trying to remind you what some of these things look like before we do the staining. Now these are dog ovaries, and I think we've seen this in some other lesson, but follicles appear like little blisters on the surface. They can be below the surface too, but we can see them on the surface. This happens to be follicles on dog ovaries. Now the dog spends part of its time not undergoing estrous cycles, which we're going to talk about here later in probably reproduction 5. But these middle ovaries are showing when the animal is basically what's called anestrus. Nothing's really going on. If you cut that ovary, you could find some very small follicles, but those ovaries look like they're not doing much at all. And then finally at the bottom, and maybe this one here is the best C, is the corpus luteum. Each one is called a corpus luteum, and each one was where a follicle ovulated, and it fills with solid tissue. And then, of course, I can't forget one of our focus animals. We did dog and cat just previously here, but I want to talk about a horse. Ovaries, and of course they're going to be bigger, and this is a little fuzzy picture, but if you look at that scale up on top, then this is in centimeters, and from this point here to 2.5 centimeters, you know, is an inch. So this ovary is 2, 3, 4 inches across, way bigger than the dog or cat, of course, and well, not maybe of course. And what's interesting, I should point this out, see this little cave-in area? It's called a fossa. A fossa is a term, general term for meaning kind of like a dip in some area, a hollowed out area, depressed area. And that's where the eggs come out on a horse ovary. And this diagram names it. This is the ovulation fossa, this point. This is the only point that will release eggs. Okay, so the eggs are going to be developing in the ovary, but then they're going to be released. And of course, the horse really only ever ovulates, usually, one egg from one of the ovaries. So one of the ovaries isn't working at that time when you're talking about work being ovulation. Whereas a dog and cat always have both ovaries working. They're never going to be perfectly even like 8 and 8 or 6 and 6, but the two ovaries are going to work in most cases for the dog and cat. The horse, one or the other. Okay, now we're ready for histology, the study of tissue, usually under the light microscope. I mean, there's all kinds of microscopes, and light microscopes basically go from 10x magnification up to 1,000, something like that. Maybe some people would say between 100 and 1,000. Depends on your scope and whatever. But I've got a couple beautiful pictures that I found. I wish that people would have left their names on them, but it's back in my illustration list. But look at this. This is a whole cat ovary, basically. So good. Here's one end, and if you followed it, it might be missing a little bit, it looks like, but it would probably be like this. So that's almost the entire cat ovary, feline ovary. Every open area is a follicle, okay? And every follicle has one egg. Like I'll make the egg right here red. That's an egg inside a follicle. There's another egg, another one. The question is, why doesn't this follicle have an egg? It does. It's just below the screen or above the screen. When you make histology sections, you do very thin microns thickness, and so that this follicle has an egg, but we just didn't capture it with the section we have. Okay, so that's really very pretty picture. Follicles, all kinds of follicles. And then here's another one that's really pretty. And of course, when you stain things, they're more colorful. They're not this color in nature, because you saw like those dog ovaries are kind of plain white, dull white. But when you stain things, you can make them colorful. So here's another case where this is the entire cat ovary. That's pretty good. Follicles, of course, blood vessels. We don't have any CLs. I'll talk about those later. I couldn't really find any cat ovaries that had some good corpus luteum in it, at least histologically speaking. But these are some great pictures. Down here is probably the oviduct. And remember, the oviduct is a tube, but you don't always get a nice cross section of a tube. I'm not sure if this is quite the uterus. It might be the uterus versus the oviduct. Really, really a great picture. Those two are, I'll leave that one right there. Those great, and then they even have a scale on it. You can see down the lower right, 1 millimeter. Excellent pictures. Okay, now we're going to look at some sections of tissue that are like much higher magnification. So we're going to see a smaller area, but we're going to get closer. And I found this one that talks about several things, and it's got labels, which is always nice. Up on top, this is the edge of the ovary. So like here, where I'm going back and forth with the red laser pointer, would be air or abdominal cavity, let's put it that way. Not air, but once you section it, there's air out here because you take the ovaries out. Germinal epithelium, this is where their eggs originally start or were formed. Primordial follicles, that's a structure that has one egg in it, and it's beginning to make a wall. I'm going to point out these two cells, and once these cells get developed all the way around and are more cuboidal in shape, then you get this structure down here. Look at those cuboidal cells. That means they look like a cube. One row, one layer thick, maybe is a better way to say that. That's a primary follicle. Now some people call a secondary follicle when you have two of these layers. Others don't. So be careful to understand that there are a couple of ways to classify things. Atretic follicles means it's dying. And you should know, and we probably stated this before, more than 99% of all follicles undergo atresia. Okay, so this is an atretic follicle. It's going to basically disappear. Okay, let's get that out of the way and then look at another diagram labeled from, looks like the medical school up in Wisconsin. I've bought some books from their bookstore once in a while. It's really colorful, and it basically shows us one follicle, and they're calling this the secondary follicle. And you know, I guess I would call this a tertiary follicle, but again, we're splitting hairs. But it does make some great layers here. I'm over here now, if you can see me, over on the 9 o'clock position. The theca externa is a layer of cells, and then right going in towards the follicle, we have the theca interna. And if you want to refresh your memory what those cells make, they make testosterone, for goodness sakes. And you could go back to the endocrine. I know the interna does for sure. I can't remember if the externa makes testosterone or not. But testosterone then will diffuse across this purple structure, which I'm going to call the basement membrane, and it goes into what's called granulosa cells, and they're calling it membrana granulosa. Okay, and these granulosa cells are going to take the testosterone that came from here and convert it in one enzymatic step to estrogen, estradiol 17 beta, probably better to say. Let's do some more. Okay, there's the nucleus of the egg. The egg can also be called the oocyte. Then the egg is one cell and it's got cytoplasm. Finally, the antrum is a fluid-filled area in a follicle. It has follicular fluid. Now, I would call this an antral follicle or a tertiary follicle. They labeled it secondary, and I'm going to say, remember, I'm not going to argue with them. There's a couple ways to do that. Maybe I learned it the wrong way. It's splitting hairs, though. Of course, you know I like to look at multiple images because the more you look at, the more you learn. And I picked this one out because they're calling this antral follicle a vesicular follicle. Okay, and I think when they say vesicular, that means there is this fluid-filled antrum. But it's just another view, not as colorful as some. Here's the egg, because the outside of the egg is called the zona pellucida. And then there's the theca interna, theca externa, antrum. They're calling this a secondary oocyte because the oocyte does go through some stages, which I'm not going to talk about. Granulosa cells are inside the basement membrane. They're making estradiol 17 beta and inhibin, by the way. And of course, you can go look that stuff up at the endocrine section. And the other thing I want to say on these ovaries is inside a follicle, no matter how big it gets, and I'll show you, there's never any blood vessels, lymph vessels, nerves, or anything. There's nothing in a follicle besides just the follicular structure. Now, none of the previous histological sections had a good corpus luteum, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just the way I looked at them, but I've found one, but it's on a mouse ovary. But that's okay, because all these ovaries, a mouse is a litter-bearing animal, so it's not going to look much different than the dog and cat. It's not going to look like the horse, of course. The horse, of course. That's interesting. Anyway, here is one corpus luteum. Here's another. Here's another. One other. Then another. So let's count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That ovary could have released 8 eggs. You might say, wow. And that's possible for a mouse. Remember, the other one's working too. But anyway, the term down here, corpus luteum, really refers to one. So here's a corpus luteum. Here's a corpus luteum. But if you want to do a collective term, you say corpa lutea. So this mouse has, let's say, 8 or 9, whatever I said, corpa lutea. You wouldn't say 8 corpus luteums. Now I want to show you a cross-section of an ovary. It doesn't matter what animal, because it was drawn by a medical illustrator. And I want to talk about some terms and some alternate names. So I'm going to blow this up a little bit. Here it is, structure of the ovary. It could well be a human ovary they modeled this after. Doesn't matter to me because for the mammals, it's basically all the same. Maybe just one little sidebar before I forget. Remember in cats, we haven't talked about, they're induced ovulators. And I did that in endocrinology, I think, in one of the sections we talked about in reflex ovulation. Okay, back to this one. Primordial follicles. That's basically follicles that aren't developing yet. When they do start developing, then they're called primary. Remember, they're going to have that one ring of cuboidal cells. Here they're just saying, hey, remember there's an oocyte or an egg. They're calling this a secondary follicle. I wouldn't quite, but remember, I might be in the minority. They get bigger. Now this gives you an idea that they might travel that far as they're growing, and that's usually not the case. Watch my red pointer. A lot of times they start up here as primordial. They might shift down here and start developing, and then they might pop up near the surface. They really wouldn't travel this far, okay? Sooner or later, you get a big egg, or a big follicle with one egg inside, sometimes protruding, oftentimes protruding, and looks like a blister, okay? Now, on that case, I call that a pre-ovulatory follicle. Another name is a Graafian follicle. And this means it's a follicle that was lucky enough to advance to that state and it's ready to ovulate. Now, that doesn't mean it will ovulate, because look at the cat again. The cat will grow follicles, make estrogen inside. Some of that estrogen goes to the brain. The cat acts like it's in heat. Everything's ready, but if the cat doesn't get mated, all those great big follicles atrophy. They will not ovulate. Now in a dog and a horse, they're spontaneous ovulators. So they will ovulate, whether they're mated or not. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we do ester cycles. And let's see, I've got one more label here. I'm going to put it over here. Remember, I call these things antral follicles if they got that fluid-filled space. Okay, now let's go back here to this Graafian follicle. It's going to ovulate. That means it's going to release the egg. And actually, see down here? This is happening here. Nothing travels after this point as far as the follicle. It ruptures at ovulation. The egg goes out and gets caught by the oviduct. The fluid leaves. And actually, this cavity fills with blood. But after 2 or 3 days, it organizes into a solid tissue, and that solid tissue is called a corpus luteum. So these stages here, even this one here, all occur back here. So they're not traveling along the edge kind of like, I know why they did that, because you've got to show the stages, but they never say, hey, all this happens back here. Some corpulutea do have like an open area in the middle that's fluid filled. It wouldn't have air, but it'd be a fluid filled cavity inside. Most of the dog, cat, and stuff do not. But when we do talk about ester cycles, we'll talk about how long the corpus luteum lives. And I think we did some of that back in endocrinology, because the endocrine lessons, because the corpus luteum is famous for making progesterone. Anyway, when it dies, it degenerates and it becomes a corpus albicans. That means a white body, basically. Corpus albicans is a corpus luteum that has died and is no longer making progesterone, and it will become smaller and smaller and smaller. You can see them with the naked eye when they first die, but then months later, you'd need a microscope to find them. And here's a list of those great illustrations that I pointed out. Thanks a lot. See you later.